we look at the fourth subtopic under our topic peasants and agricultural production. इसके पहले हमने जब peasants और agricultural production को discuss करना start किया, तो we discussed a lot of things. We discussed what kind of sources we look at when we study about the peasantry in the medieval period and the kind of agricultural production or the kind of agrarian society that we had back then. And we also talked about what were the sizes of land holdings that these peasants held to their ownership, like कितने well off हुआ करते थे ये, कितना इनके पास कितना जमीन हुआ करता था. So that determined the richness or the wealth of a certain peasantry. Then we also looked at how developed irrigation facilities were, or how much, by extension, how much these peasants who did the cultivation, who did most of the cultivation, were dependent on monsoons for their crops to survive and to grow. So these were the things that we have looked at so far under peasants and agricultural production. The fourth subtopic that we are going to study is about the crops, the variety of crops. So it's entitled as the an abundance of crops. But what we're going to see कि इंडिया में मिडिएवल पीरियड में, लाइक जब हमारे कंट्री में मुगल रूलर्स हुआ करते थे, उस पीरियड में हमारे कंट्री में एग्रीकल्चरल प्रोडक्शन जो है वो कितना वेरीड था, वो कितना हाउ मच variations it had in terms of the number of crops that were being produced. हमारी कंट्री में हम एग्जैक्टली कैसे तरीके के क्रॉप्स ग्रो करते थे, कैसे तरीके की फसल होती थी हमारे देश में, और क्या क्या क्रॉप्स हम ग्रो करते थे. So these are the things that we look at when we study this fourth subtopic under peasants and agricultural production. So we start by acknowledging the very basic fact about crop production, that is, production used to happen in two seasonal cycles. So agricultural production जो है, so cultivation kind of depends on a lot of things, of which climate and soil are like the two most important things, and so is water supply. So depending on all of these things, agriculture used to happen in two seasonal cycles. तो पहला seasonal cycle जो है वो खरीफ है, which is the season of autumn, and second one is Rabi, which is the season of spring. Now these two words are things that we have been studying from since like childhood, but we never remember कि कौन सा किस time पे आता है. So just this is something that we need to memorize by now if we're studying history or geography. This खरीफ का मतलब autumn season में होता है ये, the season when trees start to shed their leaves, and Rabi is the exact opposite of what autumn is. It happens in the springtime. So these are the two seasonal cycles when crops are grown and harvested. Normally in India, production used to happen in these two seasonal cycles. So let's analyze the facts once more. So in our country, 85% of people lived in villages. Now if all these people lived in villages or in rural areas, it implied that a majority of these people, like an enormous majority of these people, depended either directly or indirectly on agriculture for their source of livelihood. So many people, just the majority of the population was involved in agriculture, in cultivation of crops. So in crop cultivation, so all these people engaged in agriculture and growing crops twice a year. That gives us an indirect estimate of how many crops we are growing in 1 year, how many crops are being grown in our country on an annual basis at an average. So that's what we are trying to estimate here, कि हम दो seasonal cycles में crops grow करते थे. Also, apart from that, there were areas in which 3 crops were grown in a year in places with water supply. And when we say with water supply, we mean that these were either places where there was monsoon, or where there was steady rainfall, where rainfall didn't betray the area, where the rainfall was not very erratic. So these are like steady rainfall areas, or these are areas where irrigation was अवेलेबल. तो या तो इरिगेशन की वजह से पानी का सप्लाई होता था, या तो मॉनसून की वजह से रेन वाटर मिल पाता था इन जगहों में. तो ऐसी जगहें भी थी जहाँ पे 3 क्रॉप्स ग्रो किए जाते थे एक साल में. So there were like 3 seasons. So there were like first we see the majority of areas in our country used to grow 2 seasonal cycles of crops. Then also there were areas where 3 crops were grown in a year, and that's a pretty big deal considering the kind of technology that we had. So that was a pretty big deal. So these 2 factors combined gave us an enormous variety of produce. So agricultural production was, as we had discussed earlier in previous videos, agricultural production was like very developed back then. Agriculture was the primary source of livelihood that engaged the majority population, and it was also booming. Agricultural production was at a boom. तो 2 सीजनल साइकिल्स है हमारे पास. एक खरीफ है जो कि ऑटम के सीजन में आता है, एक रबी है जो स्प्रिंग के सीजन में आता है, और कुछ ऐसी जगहें हैं जहाँ पे स्टेडी वाटर सप्लाई मिल पाता है, क्योंकि या तो रेनफॉल अच्छी होती है वहाँ पे जो फसल उगाने में हेल्प करती है, या तो इरिगेशन फैसिलिटीज अवेलेबल है ऐसी जगहों पे, तो पानी सप्लाई की दिक्कत नहीं होती है. और ऐसी जगहों में 3 सीजनल साइकिल्स होते हैं, साल में 3 क्रॉप्स ग्रो किए जा सकते हैं. तो इन दोनों फैक्टर्स की वजह से हमारे पास पूरे देश भर में एक साल में बहुत ज्यादा एग्रीकल्चरल प्रोड्यूस भी था, और वो बहुत ज्यादा वेरीड भी था. मतलब इवन इन टर्म्स ऑफ क्वांटिटी एग्रीकल्चरल प्रोडक्शन वाज वेरी हाई, एंड इन टर्म्स ऑफ वैरायटी आल्सो एग्रीकल्चरल प्रोडक्शन वाज एट अ वेरी गुड प्लेस. So we had an enormous variety of produce. For example, if we talk about a few examples of a few areas in Agra, Agra is important because it used to be, the capital of the Mughal Empire at one point of time. The Mughal emperors had shifted the capital from Delhi to Agra, but then we shifted back again to Delhi. But for a while, for a certain time span, Agra used to be the capital of Mughal India, right? So in Agra there were 39 varieties of crops that were being grown per year. In Delhi there were 43 varieties of crops that were being grown per year, and in Bengal there were like 50 varieties of rice alone that was being grown. So it's quite evident that the climatic conditions and the water supply and the nature of the soil in Bengal were like very suitable for the production, for the cultivation of rice. And rice is also something that happens to be the staple diet of Bengalis. So बंगाल में उस टाइम पे 50 तरीके की राइस, 50 वैरायटीज की जो चावल होती है वो उगाई जाती थी एक साल में. So these statistics just show us that agricultural production was very varied in our country in the Mughal period. So that was about the quantity and the variations in the production. Also, there is a certain feature of agricultural production that we see in Mughal sources. तो जब हम इस चीज के बारे में पढ़ते हैं, जब हम एग्रीकल्चरल प्रोडक्शन के बारे में पढ़ते हैं मेडिएवल इंडिया की, तो हम एक बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट चीज नोटिस करते हैं. हमारे देश में जो है एग्रीकल्चर वाज समथिंग दैट वाज मेंट टू बी फॉर सबसिस्टेंस. मतलब एग्रीकल्चर इसकी प्रैक्टिस करते थे लोग ताकि वो अपने जमीनों पे अपना खाना खुद उगा सके, और जो सरप्लस बच जाता था उसको वो लोग मार्केट में सेल करते थे. बट द प्राइमरी motive of agriculture was subsistence, right? And when we see subsistence, so this is something that we have discussed previously also. When we say subsistence, it means the primary motive of agriculture was to feed the people, right? But then subsequent years we see we see a trend of growing crops that were not basically meant for subsistence, that were meant for other purposes, they were either meant for like leisurely consumption or anything besides subsistence. Now these crops that are anything but subsistence crops are what we have come to call as cash crops. तो ये क्रॉप्स जो हैं ये बेसिक कंजम्पशन के लिए नहीं है, ये बेसिक सब्सिस्टेंस के लिए नहीं है, बट दीज आर क्रॉप्स दैट yield a high revenue. So these are revenue yielding crops. Means इन क्रॉप से जो है काफी फायदा होता है, फार्मर्स को काफी फायदा होता है इन्हें बेच के, because these are something that are in demand and these crops are something that can earn money, that can earn huge amounts of revenue. Also the middlemen who were involved in the agricultural process, in the commercialization of agriculture, were also benefiting from these cash crops. तो कैश क्रॉप्स की अगर हम मिडिवल पीरियड में बात करें तो हम जो सोर्सेज से रेफर करके एग्रीकल्चरल प्रोडक्शन को स्टडी करते हैं उस टाइम की, तो वी कम अक्रॉस अ वर्ड कॉल्ड जिनसी कमिल, which the literal translation of which means perfect crops. So this is a word that we derive from our sources of study. So the translation of this word in English means perfect crops. And if we want to discuss examples of perfect crops, we have cotton. So cotton was not something that that was meant for feeding the people. Cotton was something that would help the the entire textile industry. So it was something of a cash crop. It was something that was that helped commercially, right? That somehow commercialized agriculture. It wasn't meant for subsistence. तो ये वो क्रॉप्स हैं जो सब्सिस्टेंस के लिए नहीं यूज करते थे, जो कि रेवेन्यू लाने में हेल्प करता था. सो वी हैव कॉटन, वी हैव शुगर, वी हैव ऑयल सीड्स, वी हैव लेंटिल्स एक्सेट्रा. एंड cotton was something that was cultivated in a vast stretch of our country. It was cultivation of cotton was done in like in central India as well as in the all over the Deccan Plateau. बहुत सारी जगहों में cotton cultivation होती थी. तो depending on the nature of soil and climate, etc. Also we have sugar. Sugar was something that was cultivated more in Bengal, and so these are all the commercial crops that we have. We have oil seeds, we have lentils. ऐसे crops grow किए जाते थे जो subsistence purposes के लिए नहीं थे, but जो these were just revenue yielding crops. Also we there was something about what we have learned so far was the enormous variety of produce in in agriculture in the medieval period. Also we learned about the commercialization of agriculture, which is a process that will become the most prominent in history during the British period, when the British were regulating agricultural production. But even in Mughal period we see some examples of this phenomenon. Also there was another interesting feature when you study about agricultural production. जब हम agricultural production की बात करते हैं medieval period में, तो हम एक बहुत important चीज देखते हैं कि हमारे देश में कुछ चीजें कल्टीवेट होती थी जो कि नॉर्म था, जो कि ट्रेंड था, जो कि बहुत जगहों में कल्टीवेशन होती थी इन जगहों की, इन क्रॉप्स की. बट देयर वाज समथिंग इम्पोर्टेंट हियर. During the 17th century we see the introduction of a lot of new crops, right? So these were crops that weren't grown in our country previously, but these were crops that were now being introduced to our country, to our farmers and to our cultivators by outside people, by people who were either migrating from outside or people who were helping to spread ideas, spread new information about the outside world. So anyhow, by any means, we started growing crops that weren't previously being grown in our country, but these were new introductions in the cropping cycle. So new crops were introduced in our country in the 17th century. And if we want to talk about examples of these crops, तो मेज जो है, जो कॉर्न होता है या मक्का होता है, तो ये चीज हमारे देश में पहले नहीं ग्रो की जाती थी, एटलीस्ट नॉट ऑन अ large scale. This is something that used to be grown in our country during the 17th century, and this was introduced to us by Spain and by Africa. Also, there was another trend of growing vegetables like potatoes, tomatoes, and chilies, plus fruits. And fruits like examples of these fruits that came from outside were papaya, pineapple, etc. So these were examples of certain fruits or certain crops that started being grown because of outside influence. So vegetables and fruits were introduced to us. The trend of growing these vegetables and fruits on a massive scale was introduced to us by the New World. And when we talk about the New World, we basically mean the West. So the New World, geographically speaking, as the absolute Western hemisphere of the world. So Western countries say, because the West was always more advanced and always more modern, and these were the people who were always just one step ahead the entire time. So these Western countries introduced us to the concept of horticulture, the concept of growing vegetables and fruits instead of just food grains. Earlier, पहले हमारे देश में सिर्फ food grain cultivation होता था, right? So if we were to analyze this, so earlier we used to have only food grain cultivation. We grew just अगर हम पहले वीडियोस को रेफर करें, इससे पहले जो हमने इससे पहले के सेगमेंट्स के जो हमने डिस्कस किए हैं, तो हमने देखा है कि राइस, wheat and millet. So these are the three major crops that were grown: rice, wheat and millets. Which means कि हमारे देश में जो है पहले सबसे इम्पोर्टेंट स्केल पे, सबसे मैसिव स्केल पे फूड ग्रेन प्रोडक्शन होता था. Then we see the concept of perfect crops. So these were like crops that were not meant for subsistence. These were crops that yielded revenue and that were preferred by the people. So we have like cotton, sugar, etc. as these perfect crops. And then we see fruits and vegetables which were introduced to us by outside countries, which were introduced to us by the Western countries. So we don't need to talk about examples of fruits and vegetables, those are listed here. But anyway, this is how the cropping pattern, this is how the items of cultivation changed over the years. This is how these are like the items of cultivation, and this is how it changed over the years. This is how the pattern was made. This is the kind of pattern that have been that existed in history when we talk about agricultural production in our country. So earlier we had food grain cultivation, and then we just started reforming our agricultural production. So that is how it happened. First, we talk about the enormous variety of produce. First, we acknowledge the fact that production was already very varied in our country during the medieval period or during the Mughal era. And then we acknowledge the fact that certain things called certain crops, which came to be known as perfect crops, were being grown. Examples of those crops being cotton, sugar, oil seeds like mustard and all. So these were also grown besides subsistence crops. And then we come to know that certain new crops came to our country which weren't being grown earlier, and these happened to be like maize, which was introduced from Spain and Africa, and then vegetables and fruits. तो ये था हमारा so this is we study this under the fourth subtopic, which is an abundance of crops. And so this is like the last topic under peasants in agricultural production. ये हमारा first topic जो है वो खत्म हो गया. इसके बाद हम पढ़ेंगे कि विलेज कम्युनिटी कैसी होती थी, पूरा रूरल एरिया जो था उसमें कैसे कम्युनिटी, मतलब कैसा वो कम्युनिटी हुआ करता था, वो रूरल एरिया में कैसे लोग रहते थे, एंड हाउ द कम्युनिटी वुड बी डिवाइडेड बिटवीन डिफरेंट टाइप्स ऑफ पीपल. But that is our second topic in the chapter. But before we study that, there are two like certain pieces of information that we need to discuss first. One of them is the spread of tobacco. So tobacco is like it's an addictive thing which used to be which started being grown in our country. It wasn't there earlier, but there was a sudden trend of the production of tobacco or of tobacco cultivation in our country. तो हम देखते हैं कि tobacco का production जो है हमारे देश में कैसे start हुआ. So it arrived first in the Deccan. तो Deccan Plateau में जो है tobacco cultivation सबसे पहली बार start हुआ, and it spread to North India in the early 17th century. तो धीरे धीरे ये tobacco cultivation का जो trend है ये spread हुआ, धीरे धीरे ये पूरे Northern India में spread हुआ 17th century के आसपास. So Akbar and his nobles came across tobacco in 1604. So that is like the the early years of 17th century. The king Akbar and his nobles came to know about tobacco cultivation, right? So at that point of time, when hookahs or chillums were in vogue, so at that point of time, people used to smoke tobacco in hookahs and chillums. So these are like you've probably seen pictures of hookahs and all these things somewhere or the other. This is people in earlier times used to smoke hookahs. It's not very prevalent nowadays, but it used to be very, very prevalent, between zamindars and people of upper classes living in rural areas. So, in fact, zamindars की तो ये बहुत ही prevalent practice हुआ करती हुक्का पीने का, तो उसमें जो है tobacco का use होता था. So this Akbar and his nobles came across tobacco in 1604 when people were smoking it in hookahs or chillums, and it was banned by Jahangir by the end of the 17th century. तो 17th century के जो later years हैं, later half है, उस time पे जहांगीर जो उस टाइम पे किंग हुआ करते थे, तो उन्होंने बैन कर दिया था टोबैको को, because he realized that it was something addictive and it wasn't a good thing. So he was concerned by the use of tobacco and he banned it all over the country. But then the ban proved ineffective because people just didn't listen to him. It became an important article of consumption, cultivation and trade. So tobacco had become like so prevalent and so important that even after the Mughal emperor banned it, people just didn't listen, and the spread of tobacco had become it had spread so far that it became an important article of consumption, cultivation and trade, and the ban that was put by the king on tobacco and the use of tobacco or the cultivation of tobacco proved very, very ineffective at that point of time. So this is something like the history of tobacco, or the way how tobacco came in our country and how it became very, very prevalent in our country. The next piece of information that we have is about agricultural prosperity and population growth. So हमने पढ़ा कि एग्रीकल्चरल प्रोडक्शन हमारे देश में कितना वेरीड था, कितना बूम कर रहा था उस टाइम पे. तो हम another thing that we attach here, another thing that we associate here with agricultural production is the growth in the population. तो हम ये segment जो है हम ये पढ़ने के बाद realize करेंगे कि हमारे देश का population जो था वो भी बढ़ रहा था धीरे धीरे करके. If we look at data on population of the medieval period, we realize that the population was growing at a very steady rate, not at a very fast rate, but at a very steady pace, and it was primarily because of the huge agricultural production that was happening. So an important outcome of such varied and flexible forms of agricultural production, by varied we mean the enormous variety that we have in agricultural produce. The varied and flexible forms of agricultural production was a slow demographic growth. The word demographic means whatever has to do with population. So demographic means a slow population growth. So despite periodic disruptions caused by famines and epidemics, India's population growth increased by about 50 million between 1600 to 1800. So what this means is ये जो हम इतना enormous variety था हमारे पास agricultural production का, जो agricultural production इतना boom कर रही थी हमारे country में at that point of time, तो उसका result ये था, उसका नतीजा ये था कि हमारा population जो था वो भी काफी steady rate में, वो काफी slow बढ़ा था वो, but फिर भी it was increasing, it was growing, and that was at least considering the time and the and the demographics of the area back then, it was a good thing that agricultural production was bringing about an increase in the population. So even though there were periodic disruptions in the population growth, like there have been famines and there have been epidemics, and these are counterproductive to population growth, क्योंकि जब famines होते हैं या जब epidemics होते हैं, epidemic का मतलब जब कोई बीमारी जो काफी spread कर रही है तो उसकी वजह से लोगों की मौत हो जाती है. famine का मतलब जब जब there is not enough food and there is not enough agricultural production, तो hunger की वजह से काफी लोगों की death हो जाती है. So famine is associated with a shortage of food grain cultivation, and epidemic is associated with the spread of a very lethal disease, spread of a disease that is that kills a lot of people. So when these things happen, the population growth it becomes negative. Population grows at a negative rate क्योंकि population जो है उस वक्त बहुत कम हो जाती है, क्योंकि बहुत ज्यादा डेथ रेट जो है वो बहुत ज्यादा हो जाती है इस टाइम पे. सो दिस इज एसोसिएटेड विद अ नेगेटिव पॉपुलेशन ग्रोथ. सो दीज थिंग्स रिजल्ट इन अ नेगेटिव पॉपुलेशन growth. And at that point of time, since we didn't have so if we talk about agricultural production, we didn't have too many modern farming equipments, and that is why agricultural production was not as efficient as it could have been or as it is in the present period, and we didn't have too many too advanced medical knowledge, so the spread of diseases couldn't be easily curtailed if we wanted to. तो ये famines और epidemics की वजह से काफी periodic disruptions हुई है, काफी बार population growth जो है हमारी वो negative में चली गई है, but उसके बावजूद भी हम देखते हैं कि 1600 से 1800 के बीच में, मतलब 200 साल में the population increased by 50 million, मतलब 50 million increase हुई है population की, and this would amount to a 33% increase in population. So a 33% increase in population in 200 years, between 1600 and 1800, that's 200 years. So population increased by around 33% in 200 years, and the majority of this is credited to the enormous agricultural production, or the an enormous variety of agricultural produce that we were having in our country at that point of time. So these are the two pieces of information that we had to study, which were given in our book. So now we have completed our first topic. Very soon we're going to be starting our second topic, which is about the village community.